Welcome to an IRS Rail webinar on steps to protect critical rail networks in the age of digital transformation, presented by the International Railway Summit in association with Waterfall Security Solutions. I'm Jules Omura, the Managing Director of IRIS Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this session. Our lives have been turned upside down since the arrival of a previously unknown virus earlier this year, and the health issue has quickly turned into an economy and political crisis. What has the pandemic taught us? It has taught us to prepare for unexpected crises. It has shown how connected the world is, and while this connectedness makes us rich in cultural diversity, it has also highlighted our vulnerability. This brings us to today's theme. We'll be talking about a different type of virus infection, but the parallel is clear. Fortunately, the railway sector worldwide has not yet seen a major cyber-related catastrophe to date, but the rail infrastructure is becoming more and more connected via the latest technologies like 5G, IoT, positive train control, etc. And while innovation is always welcome, this connectedness leaves critical rail infrastructure more vulnerable to the risk of a cyber attack. So I look forward to a lively debate on this very real and possibly imminent threat that the rail sector is facing. We are fortunate to have the support of eminent speakers with us today, and we are very grateful to Waterfall Security Solutions for their sponsorship, which has made this debate possible. We are tweeting live during this webinar. Follow us at Rail Summit, and the hashtag you can see on your screen is IRS Rail Webinars. If you enjoy the session, do continue the debate on Twitter and LinkedIn. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Greg Rattray. Greg is partner and founder of Next Peak, a cybersecurity risk management firm, which is now part of the global management consultancy Oliver Wyman. After retiring from the US Air Force as colonel in 2007, Greg served as Director for Cybersecurity in the White House under President George W. Bush. He then became commander of the operations group of the US Air Force Information Warfare Center. Prior to founding Next Peak, Greg held several high-level cybersecurity positions, including his tenure as the global CISO at JP Morgan Chase. Given your extensive career covering the government, military, and commercial sectors, Greg, we are honored to be able to welcome you as our guide, or shall we say our pilot, for today's debate on steps to protect critical rail networks in the age of digital transformation. Greg, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Jules. Hopefully, this will be a very engaged discussion. I think there'll be some debate, but I think we all know that the challenge is in front of us, and we'll be laying that out. We have an exceptional set of speakers to do so. So I add my welcome to Jules's, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to help engage in this important discussion. I will say, you know, as we've all adjusted to many sorts of video conferencing tools, I ask the audience's patience as we work through this. We're going to orchestrate this. We're going to use some features, including polling. So as we work through it as a team, you know, just if we have a glitch, we're ready to try to work our way through that, and appreciate everybody's forbearance in advance if we have to do so. You know, in an age of you know, growing use of cyber attacks by a wide range of adversaries, and I think probably many engaged today sort of see this as almost a week-on-week you know, increase in both the magnitude of attacks, but also the sort of sophistication of them. You know, critical infrastructure operators must understand these threats and, you know, actively manage the risks. So we're going to get great advice about that this afternoon and engage with the audience in the discussion of those things. You know, as we share more data, systems are interlinked, the dangers from cyber attack increase, but, you know, to manage risk, really you need to recognize the challenges in preparation. The session's really going to explore the risks and how to secure control center data and communications, but I think we'll go broader than that about the risks of the sector as a whole. We'll discuss the standards that can be implemented to protect operations and passengers in the years to come. So you're going to hear from 4 real leaders in this sector, who have a variety of perspectives on the issues. Again, I add my thanks to Jules's that Waterfall Security Solutions is sponsoring this session. We're going to go about half the time with a series of presentations from our 4 speakers, who I'll introduce individually as we get into their presentations. But then we'll move to questions. I'll probably remind everybody when we get to the question session, but as we move in that direction, you can use the questions section of your control panel. So if you want to put questions in as you think of them, as the presentations are going on, please do so. I'll be monitoring that, and I'll be sort of getting assistance from Jules and the team. And then there's also a raise hand button in order for you to tell the team, but particularly me, that you'd like to ask a question. So we're going to be mixing it up. When we get to that section, I'll be taking a few questions that I'd like to ask, questions from the control panel, and then I'll call on some people in the raised hand function. I will say that it's likely that we won't get to every question posed, but we'll try to get through as many as possible. So with that, I think we're ready to move into the speakers, and Jesus Molina will be our first speaker. He is the Director of Industrial IT at Waterfall Solutions, and a real renowned cybersecurity expert with over 20 years of experience in both operational technology and IT security. He's focused on protection of critical infrastructure, including rail systems across the globe. In the last 3 years, he's been extensively working on a cybersecurity project on rail operation control centers. So he's going to be right, as well as rolling stock, signaling systems. He's put his head, which is highly experienced, both technical knowledge and operational experience on this. He's a renowned researcher on both offensive and defensive cybersecurity challenges presented in Wired, Black Hat, DEF CON, IEEE security. He currently serves as the co-chair at the Industrial Internet Consortium's security panel, and he's the main writer for the Industrial Internet Security Framework. He has a PhD from the University of Maryland. So to kick us off, we have a world-renowned expert. Jesus, over to you.
Thank you, Greg, for this amazing presentation. I thank you very much for the kind words. Can you see my screen? Everything works?
We look good, Jesus.
Perfect. All right, so I'm going to talk today about how to address the cyber risk for rail. And before I kick off on addressing the risks themselves, I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2 questions that I have been asked the most, which is, are rail networks really a target for attackers? That's the first question. And the second question that I have heard a lot is, how likely is these attackers will actually affect operations rather than information? So let's move to the first question. First, are rail networks a target for cyber criminals? In the last 6 months, we have seen an absolutely unprecedented race of attacks against rail networks. 3 months ago, Stadler was hit by ransomware. They were asked for $6 million that I applaud them, they didn't pay. And also Adif recently, these last 10 days, they have been also hit by ransomware. The effects of this ransomware are not known. For Stadler, we know that they did not pay the ransom, and as a result, the files were leaked. The files about their POs and other files such as this. Now, the first question we have to ask is that after seeing that rail are actually targets, data loss has been the main issue here. And Stadler did not pay the ransom, but we have to ask ourselves if operations had been affected, did that resolution of not paying the ransom will have been as easy. This question is important because vital networks in rail are different than what we see in other verticals, such as I'll say law or any kind of federal agencies. Rail contains operational networks. Operational networks so far has gone a little bit under the radar when it comes to cybercrime. We have seen nation states attacking vital networks, critical networks. We have not seen that much of cybercriminal. But 5 days ago, the CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, has released this advisory, which is very telling. This advisory joined with NSA. They recommend immediate actions to reduce exposure across OT and control systems. And more importantly, take a look about the tactics that they provide here. If you look at the tactics, spear phishing, deploying of commodity ransomware, these three are the same tactics they have been used to attack ADIF and to attack Stadler. The three next ones are arguably complicated. You know, you have to understand how OT works. You have to understand how PLC works. However, the impact is not data loss. The impact is going to be loss of availability, manipulation of control, maybe a loss of operations, or maybe safety. We don't really know. But what we know is that the attackers will escalate. If they don't get the reward they wanted because data loss is not enough for Rail to come up with a ransom, they will escalate. So we will see more and more attacks that affect OT systems. Now, why OT systems and IT systems are in the same basket a little bit? You will think that operational networks, will not be connected to these IT systems. So, these attacks against Stadler will not pivot easily to OT. And that may be true, but in most cases we have seen that actually is not true. There is a lot of connectivity going on today between what we call the control center, the trains, and IT systems. This is because of digital transformation. We have seen vital networks such as signaling, train safety, like positive train control in the US, energy. All these systems used to be in the past closed and not connected. But more and more, because it's required by a supervising authority to report. Maybe you want this connected to your security operations centers. Maybe it's because you need to send reports of occupancy because of COVID. More and more these systems are connected through the stations, which collect, let's say, OPC UA information. They're assembled in the control center and then shared. How this connectivity is achieved is something we need to protect. And today, what we know is that the connectivity that the security that rail networks provide is very fragile. It's based on IT protections. And we have seen in ADIF case and Stadler case, attackers can bypass firewalls easily. Now we need to have better protection for these systems. Because while safety and cybersecurity are studied differently, I know that it's complicated to match these two cases. There is safety cases, assurance cases. However, what we know today is that cybersecurity is a precondition for safe and reliable operations. There cannot be safe rail network if there is not cybersecurity. And it should be using techniques that are not IT-grade techniques, but industrial-grade techniques. Now, this is, again, not me talking and asking for an improved understanding of the criticality of the networks. IEC 62443 is for automation, is a standard made for automation, but has been generally adopted by rail networks. In Europe, Senelec TS 50701 also agrees that there has to be a separation between these vital networks and non-vital networks. They actually provide 5 different levels of criticality. And we have seen before that CISA and NSA also say that OT and IT needs to be separated. In general, at Waterfall, we have 10 years of experience. What we always recommend is at least have 3 levels of criticality. Have non-critical, meaning IT systems, and then OT systems can be reliability critical or safety critical. These 3 levels of criticality should be interconnected using very robust connectivity methods. Firewalls, in general, I'm okay to use firewalls to interconnect systems with the same level of criticality. But when you move between levels of criticality that are different, you should use, or we recommend to use unidirectional gateways. Now, this is a reference architecture for vital networks in Rail. As you can see here, I put, obviously, rail networks are extremely sophisticated, but just to have an understanding, there is I put here 3 different vital networks: the energy, which has the SCADA, operational automation; train safety, which has the train control management system in the train that talks with onboard units in the train; and then signaling. All these systems at some point report to the control center, and it plays this control center report to the IT network. We suggest that any communication between the control center to an IT network that is non-critical should be done not using firewalls, but to more robust cybersecurity measures, and universal gateways is one of these. Again, when you go back to the train, same thing. If you want to communicate inside the train, which is a safety system, maybe a safety system, that train control management system, if you want to report information, you should use also universal gateways. Let's skip this one. I have been talking about unidirectional security gateways, and I think most of the attendees would be familiar with the technology. I don't have time to go into details, but what I will say is that our security is done using hardware, not software. Firewalls are software. The technique here is to use a laser that sends data only one way, and there is no way to the attacker to go back. And the software that is placed in both sides, what is done is replicating the information from the industrial network or the rail network or the vital network into the corporate network. In the corporate network, you will find a replica, and everybody will have access to this replica. And we can replicate SQL databases, OSIsoft systems, OPC UA, files. We can replicate anything. The attackers, if the corporate network there is an attack, they will be able to access these replicas of the information, but they will have no access to this vital network or critical network. Just to finalize, this is not something that we are evaluating. It's something we are actually deploying in many different customers. This is an example where a customer wanted to have information shared to the IT systems, in particular for maintenance, and to provide information for crew alerts. So we were able to provide this information by replication, basically replicating OPC servers from the OT network to the IT networks, also MySQL databases that provide the locomotive locations, and file servers. To end up, we at Waterfall has been in the space, in the OT security space for now more than 12 years. We are deployed in thousands of sites, and we have been in energy, oil and gas, and now we've seen a lot of interest in rail and a lot of systems deployed in rail. We see that the threat level, the attack level that used to be in rail has increased. It's attackers has look at rail, they are seeing that they are fragile and they are starting attacking it. So it's a time to act to better secure these systems. We have provided our views in an ebook, which is freely available. You can download it. There is the website there, and I can provide after this talk the link to all attendees. And I hope that this discussion in the Q&A, I will be able to discuss a little bit more the use cases, what we have seen, and how to better secure the perimeter for rail networks. Thank you very much, Greg. I'll give it back to you.
Thanks, Jesus. We'll very operational view, and we'll get back to it, I'm sure, in the discussion session. I'm going to bring on stage our next speaker, Tom Farmer. He's the Assistant Vice President for Security at the Association of American Railroads. Tom coordinates the development of the railroad industry's security policy and serves as the principal rail industry liaison with the federal government departments and agencies on matters pertaining to security, both physical and cyber. And as a person who worked a lot from the financial services sector, these public-private partnerships and both working with regulators and with the operational security agencies in the government are an essential part of protecting critical infrastructure. Tom is the chair of the Surface Transportation Security Advisory Committee, established to help the TSA administrator on priorities, as we were just discussing, and his professional career includes 2 tours of active military service, both in the Army and the Air Force. And I'll have to say he moved in the right direction in the second stage of his career. So with that, over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Gary, very much. Is the sound coming through okay?
You're good.
Good. Thank you, sir. Yes, I do believe I made the right move when I was assigned in Germany in the Army. Each Christmas, the commanders of Air Forces Europe and the Army in Europe give their briefings, and the Army focus is always on operations and weapon systems, and the Air Force guy was always talking about clubs and lodging facilities. So I do think I made the right direction. I think the Air Force commander figured he'd always get the weapons money to take care of the troops first. Looking at this very important subject, thank you for the opportunity to address all participants in the webinar today, and thanks to all the participants for taking time from what I know are demanding schedules to join this forum. I want to commend my colleagues on the panel, Gary as well. All of them are burdened with myriad responsibilities. They took time to commit to this event because they saw some true value in having this caliber of a discussion. My colleagues Michael Woodson at the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, Kyle Mallow at the Washington Metropolitan Area Transportation Authority, working there on the Washington, D.C. metro system. They've had to deal in particular with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, with the ongoing civil unrest, and I know their schedules have been particularly demanding, so particular compliment to each of you for your participation in this event. I've been with the railroad industry for the past 10 years, and when I first joined back in April 2010, had a meeting with some of the security leads from the major railroads that operate in the U.S. and Canada. And one of them, representing Union Pacific, made a comment to me that has stuck ever since. He said, "We've been doing security in the railroad industry since Jesse James was robbing trains." And he said that without a hint of arrogance. It was a factual statement in recognition of the legacy that security professionals carry forward in this industry. They had to deal with all manner of threats for 150 years and more. They had to adapt to those different kinds of threats. And at the time that I took this position, the principal focus was on terrorism prevention. And in the course of my tenure, it shifted to integrate in a large way cybersecurity as well. And so the adaptability, the flexibility, the coordinated effort that the railroad industry has brought to these range of threats over many decades, is a very similar approach that we're applying today. And I say we, the credit belongs to the railroads themselves. We operate in the North American railroad industry with a coordination group called the Rail Information Security Committee. And what's very interesting about this group is that it was formed at the initiative of the 7 Class 1 railroads in Amtrak. And the 7 Class 1 railroads are BNSF Railway, CN, Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, Kansas City Southern, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, and CSX Transportation. And along with Amtrak, the leads for each of those railroads, the cyber information technology leads, cybersecurity leads at the time, proposed in 1999 to have a group to consult on matters concerning information technology security and the safety implications. Now, the impetus for them getting together then was the year 2000 and changeover, and the concerns of what would happen with these automated systems that had not been designed to deal with that shift from 19 to 20. Well, they found, thankfully that didn't turn out to be the problem that was assessed, but they found that interaction so very productive that they brought it forward and continued it. And so in the North American railroad industry, led by the 7 Class 1 railroads and Amtrak, and expanded since, we've had a coordination committee focused on cybersecurity now for 2 decades. That is a commitment, and that is a consistency, that is a devotion to a cooperative effort, sharing effective practices, sharing information is very admirable. And I've been privileged to work with that group here for the past 10 years. It was their impetus that brought it to the floor. It's been their impetus that's expanded over time. We now have membership with Genesee and Wyoming Railroad, which owns and operates numerous short line carriers in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, and Australia. Another participating organization representing commuter rail interests is the Virginia Railway Express. We have RailLink as a participating organization. That's the Information Technology Operations Support Group. It's part of our organization, Association of American Railroads. And the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, along with my organization, the Association of American Railroads, supports the group's efforts as well. That comprehensive approach focuses on what can we do in building a community of interest focused on cybersecurity. There have already been a couple of references on this call to COVID-19, and we have seen how organizations have adapted under very difficult circumstances necessitated by the virus. In information technology, that has included a vast expansion in the volume of workers getting on the networks, teleworking from remote platforms. And the resiliency of what railroads have established has been well demonstrated in the seamlessness, by and large, of that transition. Importantly, the attack surface expands dramatically with that sort of work. And yet we have seen the cybersecurity procedures, the cybersecurity measures, the lessons learned over time, the looking forward and trying to anticipate potential threats. All of that work are coming to bear in ensuring the networks remain protected. And with COVID-19, there's a lot of discussion of community transmission. And with this committee effort in the railroad industry, you really have a kind of community expertise, community experience brought together. This group convenes twice monthly in teleconferences, meets in person 2 or 3 times a year, participates in a national industry exercise coordinated by my organization that's held each October, focusing on physical and cybersecurity, encompassing operations and infrastructure in the U.S. and Canada. Within their organizations, they manage extensive investments and staffs focused on cybersecurity, and cooperatively through the committee, they share the benefits of their experience in their own organizations, planning, preparations, what they're seeing on their networks, what they're seeing directly at their networks, what they're doing about it, what's working well, what do they learn that can help others who may face similar experiences to ensure that they're prepared. Collectively, this group accounts for in excess of 85 to 90% of the infrastructure and operation in the U.S. and Canada. And so you have the right people in the right places doing the right things to anticipate problems and narrow the susceptibility of the railroad industry in North America to the sorts of challenges we've seen unfortunately impact other industries. It is very much a comprehensive approach. It is looking at the problem from the perspective of, again, what each organization gets from its own experience, how it shares that with its colleagues, as well as what we do collectively through that committee, looking at priorities for industry action from which all the participating railroads, not just in the committee, but across the industry at large, freight and passenger, U.S. and Canada, can benefit also. And that's a very important point, because what this committee does in working through this forum is not just focused on the directly participating railroads, the outcomes, the lessons learned, the recommended protective measures, the information advisories that we work on to ensure there's broad awareness of potential cybersecurity concerns. All of that information is shared widely across our industry. We also share it broadly with colleagues in other industries across sectors and with partners in government. And Greg raised a very good point earlier about the interaction between the government industry and how vital that is, referencing the public-private partnership. And with this committee, we have very much tried to put into effect the public-private partnership in action. So the National Infrastructure Protection Plan in the United States, dating back to 2006, established structures, encouraged industry to organize in councils in ways that would facilitate more effective interaction between industry and government to deal with a range of threats. And over time, that concept has been applied in cyber as the threats and the concerns have increased, particularly in the last 10 years. Well, in the railroad industry, we already had the right kinds of structures in place to establish the sector coordinating councils for industry. It was this committee, the Rail Information Security Committee, and it was the colleagues on the fiscal side, the Rail Security Working Committee. Those two industry committees formed this channel of communication and interaction representing the railroad industry with the government of the United States in particular, and also in many ways in Canada as well. In doing that work, we have focused particular attention on intelligence priorities. It is vital to understand the threat. Jesus made some very good points about awareness, about understanding, about how that can inform the right actions to narrow susceptibility to, again, events that have unfortunately impacted other industries. And we just don't look to threats directed against rail. We're looking broadly. And early on, we began to pursue this process. We got some pushback from government. They were asking questions. Why are you asking about what's going on in other industries? Well, the answer is there's nothing about most cyber activity directed against critical infrastructure that is specific to a particular industry. The tactics, which we're particularly focused on, the tactics can be used against any type of organization. And so it is rare that there is something particular about a tactic employed against industry that would limit its impact strictly to that industry. And so we've worked hard with government to convince them of the wisdom of that approach, and we've gotten some very good responsiveness. When we've worked with government, we've looked at the problem in a very practical way. We want to understand better from government. And if you can consider what the United States government does, it is a target of a vast amount of illicit cyber activity, to include that directed by nation states. It is also involved in monitoring activity and receiving reports on activity across the critical infrastructure sectors of the American economy. It has a broad perspective on what is happening in cyber attacks directed against U.S. government organizations and the private sector. And we have asked the government specifically, working through the Department of Homeland Security, through the Federal Bureau of Investigation, through the Department of Defense, to focus their efforts on 4 categories of effort. We really want to have government analysis help us understand, augmenting the private sector sources that we rely upon for intelligence, but use that government analysis to focus on 4 fundamental areas. And those 4 fundamental areas are, what are the tactics that are being seen occurring most of the time? What are the vulnerabilities that are most often exploited? When analysis is done of an attack or attempt, what protective measures were found to be lacking? Or ideally, what protective measures made the difference in preventing the harm from escalating? And then lastly, the 4th category, what are the indicators that were present that should have given the organization, could have given the target organization an opportunity to anticipate what may have been coming? And we based this approach on a lesson we took from experience in Australia. And the Australian government, through its cyber emergency response team, published a report that indicated that in 85% of the cases in which the Australian government had to assist the private sector in Australia in addressing the effects of cyber attacks, in 85% of those cases, if 4 categories of protective measures had been put into place, none of those matters would have transpired as they did. 85% of them simply would not have happened as they did. And so we took from that an opportunity to work with the government in the United States and in Canada and focus on that sort of analysis. Help us understand the threat profile. And within our industry, we've got the right experts, all of whom are members of our committee and participate very actively, who can take that sort of information and translate into the informed awareness, the informed vigilance, and the sustainable protective actions that can narrow our risk profile to that sort of activity. And to work with government in that way, we have also focused a lot of attention on how do we share that information effectively? How do we ensure that government can share with us effectively? One of the challenges you have with government is often a fascination with the perpetrators. Who's doing it? Who's the responsible party? What country might be involved? And in many cases, we take the viewpoint, if you've ever watched the movie The Fugitive starring Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones, the memorable scene early in the film where Tommy Lee Jones, who's chasing down Richard Kimball, this escaped, Harrison Ford playing Richard Kimball, this escaped felon, wrongly convicted, but Tommy Lee Jones is simply doing his job. He confronts them, and Harrison Ford turns to Tommy Lee Jones and says, "I didn't kill my wife." To which Tommy Lee Jones responds, "I don't care." And very simply, often when we're dealing with organizations, attribution in government, in the railroad industry, we take the same position. We're not so much interested in attribution as we are in what's happening, how it's happening, and what can be done to narrow the risk exposure. And I guess those four parameters, yet once again, what tactics are most often used, what vulnerabilities are most often exploited, what protective measures are most often found lacking, and lastly, what indicators were missed that could have made a difference. We feel like if we can focus in those areas, we can really condense the scope of the risk considerably, and then really begin to force adversaries to get off their A game, their what you might call their D or C or D game right now, which they don't have to be particularly good because in many cases they're successful with not so sophisticated tactics, and force them in a direction where they're off of their current script and have to improvise and perhaps shift some of the advantage longer term. At AAR, we have a group that I'm privileged to lead, working with Genevieve Corrins, who is our manager of the group, the Railway Alert Network. We also have a cybersecurity director, Janet St. John. And the three of us who, through our efforts, manage what's called the Railway Alert Network. We take this information we get from a range of sources, private sector intelligence sources, government sources, DHS, FBI, other agencies. We package them in advisories that we send industry-wide. We also play another very important role, and that is taking the actual experience reported by railroads and sharing that broadly. So there's a good awareness across our industry of what's actually being seen in terms of suspect activity directed at networks. And the reporting done by railroads, and in particular the reporting done by the participants in the Rail Information Security Committee, is vital to that effort. And it gives us the means to take practical experience and share it very quickly to show what happened, what are the technical indicators, what measures did the railroad take in light of what it was observing or experiencing, and make some recommendations on protective actions that other organizations can take. And so whether it's a rather complex phishing attempt or it's odd activity coming from various IP addresses, we focus on those priorities, we get it out to the right people. And we have found on several occasions, I can point to half a dozen occasions over the past 15 months, in which that sort of sharing gave early notification to railroads across our industry. And with that awareness, they took measures that when that activity began to be directed at their networks, they had the right action in place. And Gary, as the last point, you referenced the Surface Transportation Security Advisory Committee. We are looking to take that model and apply it broadly across surface transportation modes to spur that similar type of information sharing. And one final point, we don't limit our work to our industry. We've reached out to suppliers of railroads, and we've formed a joint suppliers cybersecurity group, with which we'll be conducting an exercise later this year, again, for the purpose of elevating awareness and benefiting from that community of expertise and experience we can bring together. Thank you all very much for your attendance. I'll certainly be available for questions later on in the webinar.
That was great, Tom. Thanks a lot. I mean, it's no doubt we'll return to sort of the notions of both warning and intelligence, as well as how to work together to meet these threats as we get into the Q&A. You know, we're going to turn to our next speaker here, and our next two speakers, you know, from my perspective, are the types of people that are very much on the front lines. Having had my time as a CISO, I respect deeply what the two next speakers who have to protect organizations day to day, you know, with cybersecurity. And our first, Kyle Malo, has a few questions for us. So, Anja, if you would, why don't you put up the poll, and we'll do the poll first. And as people are answering the poll, I'll introduce Kyle. So the quick poll, and we ask all the attendees to answer the following questions, but is what's the most effective way of building a cybersecure supply chain? And I've been asked to sort of go through each of the potential responses. Please pick one. First, compliance with legal and regulatory requirements. Second, coordination within the internal governance system. Third, collaboration between OT and IT departments. Fourth, training procurement teams to be cyber aware. And fifth, developing a cyber risk or a risk-based procurement policy. Again, the notion is to pick one. I will say from not an answering person for this, but all of these seem like good things to do. So I'd advise that you pick the thing that you think is most impactful from your perspective. And we'll take probably about 30 seconds to do that. And as you answer those questions, I'll give you a little bit about Kyle's background. This is his second time in the CISO chair, having been the CISO first for the FBI, and to the points just made by Tom, dealing with a government agency that handles the most sensitive of information and is subject to a lot of cyber activity. But he's now the CISO for the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, the U.S.'s second largest commuter system, with over 1 million daily commuters leveraging rail and bus services. He's leading the Transit Authority's efforts to evolve its cyber program, focused on threat intelligence, as we just heard about from Tom, and the adoption of risk management framework to accredit all systems and applications. He's currently partnering with the American Public Transportation Authority and the National Academies for Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Transportation Research Board to develop industry standards for cybersecurity. And as somebody that worked with the financial services industry to try to create a NIST-based financial services cyber profile that everybody could use in the industry as we dealt with the regulators and each other, I think those sorts of efforts are critical. So we see in front of us now, Andrew has given us the results. Interestingly, the notion of the procurement policy being sort of the most impactful, with a close second from OT and IT departments. To me, they're different, but both critical. First is internal in terms of making sure that you don't get into silos in cyber, and then second is doing something strategic and long term, and having actual policy that guides procurement decisions, which again is actually a cross silo activity, I guess, from my own experience as a CISO. So with that, Kyle, I'm going to turn the session over to you.
Hey, thanks so much. And you can hear me okay?
You're good, Kyle.
Great. All right, well, I appreciate everyone's time and the opportunity to speak with you all. I can tell you, I've been with Metro for about 18 months right now. The DC area is obviously very unique in terms of the threats we face. I wanted to focus today, there was a lot of material I considered presenting, but I thought really focusing for a group that is, I think, mixed with folks that are on the vendor and the manufacturing side and those on the operating side, like myself, that talking about supply chain and talking about how we really try to innovate in this area over the last year and a half is probably a really important conversation for us to have. And if you're on the vendor or the manufacturing side, what we're talking about implementing, what we're talking about in terms of baseline standards and requirements, if you haven't seen them yet coming from the people buying the stuff, I think it's only a matter of time. And what I've asked of my partners that are on the manufacturing side, the vendor side, is to be proactive in implementing security controls so that we're not having to mandate it from a contractual perspective. But that is where we are right now, so that's where I'll focus. Obviously, you look at post 9/11, you talk about terrorism in the nation's capital, major cities like New York and Chicago and so forth, that the physical side of defending a rail, and specifically commuter rail, we've got, as Greg pointed out, for us, millions of passengers every day. The physical security side has obviously been something that this industry is focused a lot on. We focus on safety of our customers and so forth. Where I think we've very rapidly evolved is that cyber terrorism has now come on to the stage, the main stage, and as has been kind of talked about a little bit, and I'll talk about in this presentation a little bit, the connectivity between OT and IT, and I think Jesus kind of brought this up, is real. This is something, but it's real in its real time happening right now. We are layering the technologies right now, sometimes for the first time ever that some of these technologies have ever talked to each other, and that introduces a whole new set of risk. So why do I talk about this, right? Why do
Kyle, sorry to interrupt. We can't see your slide. I think okay. If you can accept our invitation to share your screen, then we can We should see your slides.
Let me see if I can find it, because I do not see the invitation. Give me one second. Apologize. I do not have the invitation right now. I apologize.
Okay, let me.
I can.
And as they're working on it, I will remind the audience that everybody has access to all the presentations in the chat room, so you can get to them if we're still working on this
There we
call.
Mine,
there we go.
I just got the option. Yep, thank you.
Yes, there you go. Thank you.
Okay, apologize. So let me flip to the first slide here. Right. So why should we protect the supply chain, right? Well, there's two ways to look at supply chain. When I was at the Bureau, we had these conversations all the time. There's the actual interference with the manufacturing process itself. And we see nation states particularly take an interest in this approach. How can they influence something behind the scenes so that when it's delivered to the customer, it's already compromised? From a cyber perspective, there's already malware, a sleeper malware, if you will, that's already been baked into the procurement or into the development of the product. Second way, of course, they can exploit things is through an actual weakness that just naturally exists, right? A 0-day, if you will. But the result is the same for us. That is compromise. And from us, I'm worried about our customer safety. I'm worried about our customers' PII, their credit card information, our employees, obviously reputation. The conversation I have within our organization is what happens the day after the cyber attack? What happens to our ridership levels? What does that mean in terms of revenue? And that's obviously it's a bad day. And if the thing that's compromised is something that one of you has helped to build, what does that look like for your company if that's the compromised device? Obviously, then this points to reliability on the system, safety, and as point out, revenue. So when I go through this presentation, there's 5 quick points I'm going to try to make. One, don't wait for regulation. And I will talk about what's coming down very quickly, what we're seeing. Who are the key players in your organization? Who buys technology? I can tell you in our organization, it's all over the place because who buys OT in rail is different from who buys it on the bus side of the house. And it's certainly very different from who buys pure IT or more the traditional IT. The fact that the two are layered, interconnected, what that means now for an organization that's running these kinds of services, how you deal with your contracting and procurement folks, because we like to hide technology in procurements. I hate it, but our folks like to do it. They like to make these omnibus kind of procurements, and it makes it really nebulous and hard to figure out what's a technology buy. And how you look at accepting certain amounts of risk, though. We can't secure everything 100%. I wish we could, but it's just not possible, and so we talk about the risk. As we get into the law and regulation then, these are just examples, right? I just was trying to grab a few samplings of what we're seeing. And the problem we have in the industry right now, in the federal government in the United States, and then at the state level, and I know we've got some folks from outside the United States, but it becomes even more complicated inside the US because states make their own laws, and the federal government slowly makes laws, and I mean slowly. And so we are all each, depending on where we operate out of, and I get, the great pleasure of covering 2 states and a district, so that makes it even more difficult for me sometimes. But each one of these layers on requirements for an organization that we will oftentimes pass on to the folks who are building this technology for us. And the most recent defense authorization bill is probably the most important one now, because it starts to reduce our ability, one, to do business with non-tariff countries. And that means basically countries that are not in good standing with the United States for various political reasons or economic reasons. And so that's one thing we've got to take into account. But further, they've now mandated that we validate that we are and attest to the fact that we are following some kind of cybersecurity framework. Principally, either it's usually ISO or NIST are the 2 higher end ones. And I can tell you, we follow NIST. I think a lot of organizations are leaning that way right now because it tends to be, I think, the most comprehensive. If I'm going to follow a NIST framework and I have to certify that in order to get hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding, I can tell you that things like supply chain, how we secure the technology we're buying, is not just something we like to do, it's now something we're going to have to do. So you're going to see, that's why I say I think you're going to see a lot more of this. But for organizations right now where there isn't necessarily a clear standard, you must do all of these things, which we're not there yet, my word of caution is, as you look at how the states are passing particular laws right now, is to look at how we interface with our vendors. We scrutinize the agreements we have with third parties and suppliers, because their security posture relates to your security posture. For me, I've got an organization that works on our rail cars that remotes into our network in order to do updates on the platform they provide. Well, that means that their security is really important to me. And when we created that negotiation, when we created that partnership earlier on, a decade or longer ago, we didn't mandate any cyber standards on their side. And so these are things we're looking at as we relate with folks going forward. Internal to the organization, then, governance, while it might sound very policy-driven and mundane, is truly important, because, as I mentioned, where you're buying things will often vary in the organization. And so making sure you understand it's not just your folks that work in acquisitions, not just your IT people, but includes your OT people, are stakeholders in the process of implementing cybersecurity standards across the organization. What I caution then, and certainly things that I've experienced, is an inconsistent application of cybersecurity, meaning you'll hold one element of the organization to a certain standard and then you'll waver on a different one, a different element of the organization. The problem you have there is, of course, the organization talks to itself, and it reduces the trust in your cyber team to actually execute this function fairly across the organization. How do you audit the fact? So once you've got these mandates in, how are you auditing for that kind of compliance is a question that I think has to be addressed. And are the standards that you're coming up with realistic? And does everyone agree and have that buy-in that the standards, the thresholds you're setting, the risk-based standard for cybersecurity, is it a realistic approach? And what I mean by that is the risk associated with certain technologies is much higher than others. I am far more concerned with a rail car than I might be with a small bus that is obviously disconnected from the network, whereas rail cars are very much now starting to talk to networks through Wi-Fi. And so I might not mandate the same level of security standard on the bus that I do on the rail car. And I think most of us feel pretty comfortable with this definition, right? But the difference between OT and IT historically has been pretty easy to define, that these things operate on one network, separate. They're often air-gapped, which is very helpful, historically have been air-gapped, and they do things. And this is important in commuter rail because it means that their actual lives at risk if we're not securing a lot of this technology. Again, those people that are riding on the train, a lot of bad things could happen if we're not taking the right kind of steps to secure the technology itself, the OT side. And as we then layer them, right, we say, okay, I want more data. I now have the ability to pull data from these OT components, maybe it's an RTU, and then or maybe it's the train itself, and then make smarter business decisions. I can do less maintenance, or I can do more timely maintenance that saves resources, human resources, as well as the actual equipment and financial impact, right? And so businesses want this, and it makes good sense. But when you take a network that has historically had no security or very little security, and all of a sudden you build that bridge, it's an open season for the adversaries. And that's what we're worried about right now, because we're in the middle. I tell my team this every day. We are in the middle of living this bridge building. We'll look back on this a decade from now and be able to say, wow, look at what we saw happening, and hopefully we can look back and say we did it smart, we did it understanding that cybersecurity was important. Engaging procurement, right? So I kind of mentioned this, and this is the fun part about this whole program as we try to stand this up. Certainly in my organization, I know a lot of my peers are trying to do the same thing, is that we hide technology, right? We'll do a staffing contract, looks like it's for personnel, and then somewhere in there it says, oh, by the way, and your staff shall actually build a new application. We'll say that we're just buying these monitors, but in fact, we really are having the monitors connect back to the network so that they can display passenger information, right? And of course, the rail car. Again, a lot of organization, I think we were spreading that message, but a lot of folks just don't think of a rail car as an actual piece of technology. And there are now thousands of processors on board a single modern car. Certainly our last batch, it was a tenfold increase in the number of processors from one generation to the next generation that we deployed at Metro. So we've got to train our contracting staff to actually be on the lookout for this. Don't just glaze over it, and don't think that just because it says I'm buying people or I'm staff augmentation that there's no technology in there. They've got to ask these tough questions. And then we've got to be ready to actually accept that and start putting those requirements on. So adding cyber to an actual workflow review process is really important. We're doing that right now. The application wasn't designed for that, right? So I'm actually having to work with our application side of the house to get a new approval step put in there. And the education process can be a bit time consuming, but it really is important for the program to succeed. And last, I'll hit on my fifth point, is this risk-based cybersecurity language. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, that there are certain requirements. One of the things we did, I'll point to this because I think it's a good example, is on our rail car procurement for the newest series that came out, we put our procurement hit the street at the end of last year. And there was a lot of attention. So I found myself really having to ramp this up very quickly because of the attention paid. And I know my gentleman who's going to speak after me, Mike, was facing similar questions around certain countries procuring rail car or manufacturing rail cars, and is there a potential threat to the United States? And so we layered on probably the highest level of requirement against that type of procurement, one that I know is going to cost the organization hundreds of thousands of dollars because the vendor is going to simply pass on the cost to us. And what we layered on top was the mandate for cleared third-party testing, penetration testing, and review of security standards in the rail car itself. And when I say cleared, I meant only a US-based company that has a DoD clearance could conduct that testing and then would certify the results of that directly back to us. And that was the only way I could get around the fact that, and I think it was, Tom who was saying, gave the great analogy around the movie, right? I don't care, right? That's exactly what I told our board of directors and our executive team is I don't care what the threat country is. I don't defend against specific countries. I defend against all of the threats. And so by layering in this third-party requirement, which was a risk-based approach, I would not use a cleared defense contractor to do third-party testing on every procurement. It would be cost prohibitive. But on a billion or multi-billion-dollar procurement like that, yeah, adding in an extra couple $100,000 maybe was the right thing to do to mitigate that risk. So we have to then, so to do that, we have to say, okay, what is this technology actually going to do? Is it going to touch people, right? Physically, are they going to be on this technology where there's life safety concerns? Is it a command and control system? What kind of information does it actually process? Does it carry credit cards? So is a terrorist worried about credit cards? Probably not, right? I mean, maybe if they're trying to finance their own operations, they'll take that approach. But largely, I'm not as worried about that, right? So there's that all then layers on certain requirements. And what we look at is that on the right-hand side of the slide here is this attestation now from vendors. What are we expecting you to do? Access control standards, product configuration. I will tell you right now, it'll blew my mind, and hopefully we're going to get past this very quickly as a sector. But passwords being stored clear text and default to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We get so many technologies sent to us that come that way and are installed that way without even basic security controls. So even the conversations I have with my peers that I have with APTA and others is, look, even if you can't afford right now to hire a full cybersecurity team for your industry, your authority, there are certain baseline things that everyone can do that should cost very little money. And I would not expect a vendor to charge me to have passwords set to something more complex following NIST standards, right? So if you're on the manufacturing and vendor side, these are the kind of things I'm asking right now when I get out here and have these kind of conversations is do this for us proactively. Don't make me ask to have basic cyber hygiene built into what you're selling. So with that, I will, because I know we're flying through time, that's the end of my presentation, the component.
That was great, Kyle. And that notion that you're managing cyber risks, as much or, in some dominantly in the near term through the supply chain, and that there's great attention particularly by the federal government right now on that concern, is sort of needs to be in front of mind, and you went through that really deeply, so that was great. Michael, you're going to be our cleanup hitter. So before I turn it over to you, I'll do a bit of an introduction. I'll also call out to the audience. We're going to be moving hopefully in 10 minutes or so to the Q&A session. I've got some questions lined up in my own mind, but if you want to start putting questions in the question portion of the control panel, this would be a great time from what our previous speakers or Michael is about to say. Michael is responsible, basically up in Boston. And, Michael, we haven't had a chance to chat, but I grew up in Boston, and I took the T to a number of Red Sox games. So, when I do that in the future, I'm in your hands in terms of making sure I'm safe. So interested to hear what you're going to say. You're responsible for the total information security needs and the development of a comprehensive strategy for MBTA. You're a professional with over 20 years experience, and again, in this realm, both operational and information technology. Previously at Infosys Limited, where he's been a senior vice president at a consulting group's cybersecurity advisory practice. So he's seen this from a number of places. He's been at Santander, State Street, so in the industry that I recently came out of, the financial services industry, as well as Tata Consultant Services. So again, a wealth of experience, and similar to Kyle, also has been in law enforcement at the Boston Police Department, and an adjunct professor at Northeastern, where my dad went to school as an undergraduate. So Michael, with joint Boston roots, I'm going to turn the session over to you. Michael, I think you're on mute, or we can't hear you.
All right, thank you, Greg. Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good.
Able to hear me now. All right, and you should be able to see my presentation as well. And so
we do.
All right, excellent. So good afternoon to you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm glad to see that you've had the opportunity to, and you grew up in Boston, to experience a great system here at the MBTA. Like Kyle, I've been in this industry about going on 17 months, but I've done a lot of research, and I've been talking to a lot of people globally in Europe, Australia, as well as in China, and those in Singapore. Some of them being my former peers when I was at the embassy in Indonesia. However, one of the things that we're seeing for me is, and what I've been told, is that these systems were legitimately closed off. And over the last 3 years, we're seeing conversion of technology. We're now, as you might have heard from Kyle, from Jesus, they have to talk to each other. And sometimes some of these systems that you're talking with each other, some of them are legacy systems that are still there. With the adoptions of new technologies, we're seeing an accelerated rate of this adoption moving towards what we call commercial off-the-shelf technologies. And so thus giving prudence to where we're seeing a rise in the industry, where by 2020, it's going to be huge here in North America as we move to commercial off-the-shelf technologies. My role here at the MBTA has been in the security modernization effort, to kind of join our colleagues around the globe and to have us get to a level of where steady state of an operation that is going to be looking across the enterprise and that thing. So, and if you can, I'm going to show my screen. Are you seeing my screen? Just want to double check. Check. Are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen, Mike.
Okay, guys. All right. Just want to make sure. So with that in mind, let me, I'm trying to, because I'm having a technical difficulties here of seeing the presentation isn't speaking. So one of the things is, in the industry as we're growing, our industry and transit, one thing I've learned that rail systems are more and more connected and they become more open. The other thing that I'm seeing is the amount of threats that we're seeing more and more, that we've seen in the financial sector, some similarities of the approach. And you've heard Kyle talk about nation states. You've heard Thomas talk about it, Jesus touch base on it. But the nation states are particularly into focusing on our infrastructure. And one of the things is that we have to be careful as we get into conversion, like oil and gas, like pharmaceutical, like healthcare, and financial industry. We have to do a proactive, large approach and be very forthcoming in information sharing. And that's going to be a key for all of us to win in this arena of cybersecurity. The other area is where we have to immerse ourselves is to get familiar with the issue of risk. And so risk management is going to play a very important role when it comes to managing these threats, these potential threats, and knowing what your risk appetite is and being able to manage that to an acceptable level. When I came into this industry, I started doing initial research to come into the industry because I came from critical infrastructures in the oil and gas industry. I've spent time, like I said, in pharmaceutical and financial sector. But one of the things that I saw was that the threats itself and the emergence between the operation and the technology was disjointed. And now I'm seeing as the months have progressed, them now becoming unbelievable. And so welcome to convergence. But one other thing that I didn't see was the adoption of a uniform approach to standards. And so, as Kyle alluded to on our supply chain people, we now have to bring in our procurement people to make it a requirement that says, hey, you shall have this, according to, NIST standards. You shall have this according to IEC standards. One of the things I like what they're doing in Europe is really pushing those standards and making it the mandate. And so the collaborative efforts of bringing in procurement, bringing in your people in purchasing and saying, look, even as budgeting, that, hey, these are the language, these are the issues, and you have to be very transparent on the information that you're sharing. So, and Greg, I'm having trouble and moving my slides, so we can do so. I appreciate it as well.
Yes, Mike, we can show your slides on your behalf. If you can just share.
I'm moving it.
Yeah,
seems to be.
Yeah, we'll share that.
All right, we're good. All right. So again, the railway cybersecurity market says here North America is expected to grow, and then look at that by 2027 it increased. And so we're seeing that because of the adoption of new digital solutions across the business units and the requirements. But one of the things that we have to be careful is by introducing these new technologies, and as conversion comes in, it's no longer separated, operational versus IT, that what are the vectors that we're introducing? And we need to be proactive in making sure that we address them and making sure we mitigate. So what is causing this increased cyber risk? There are 5 areas you can see. We're a digital world. The pace of innovation overnight rapidly is becoming available. And we're kind of have a lag with implementation. And mainly, typically, what I've seen and what I'm seeing in this industry is that a lot of our colleagues have been stuck in niche markets and niche suppliers. And so now the commercial off the shelf is now accelerating the means of getting faster in terms of getting to the surface of implementing technology. So with that adoption is going to become a lot of risk. And so we in my environment, we're sharing up a group of individuals who are committed to partner, and we always like to tell ourselves we're in the business of right. And when I say that to my team, the right thing for the business, educating the business to enable them in the right way. And sometimes it's been the business of no, but in order to do so and facilitate innovation, you have to partner, and so that collaborative approach is very important. And then this comes to as Kyle had mentioned earlier with some of the agencies, and also Thomas alluded to it, some of our extended agencies, data sharing, information sharing, interchanging that information, whether it be related to attacks, intelligence information, and aligning that to manage your vulnerabilities. That's also going to be key because the attacks are becoming more sophisticated in time. So let's look at an overall rail system. So in the operational, security, safety and security, passenger experience. It's a balance in it. And so as we're implementing new technologies, we're going to see this convergence now all out at this ecosystem. We're going to have to put take a holistic approach to managing this all. Where places we didn't necessarily need to do that, because now everything, thanks to IPv6, has an IP address, and they're beginning to talk to each other. That's where we're going to have to look at it, just like looking at from the outside into a fish tank with the various fish in it swimming around, and making sure that we properly patch them in a timely manner, that we have information about that. And so all that information is shared up into our CDMBs, and that there are people able to reference what it is, what the issues are, what the patch requirements are, etc., and align the intelligence information with your vulnerability management program and your risk management program. So moving forward, and when you're doing typically of these zones that people have and then broken down, these are some of the typical railway system components that we have. The external zone, the enterprise, corporate zone, operational, fire, life safety zones, safety, critical security zones. Before these were all air gap. Convergence has come together. It's brought this into one of the things that we've got to come, adopt in standards during the procurement process to make sure it's a uniform, one strategy, one methodology based on an architecture that's defined. So we need to be able to do that and communicate that to the business, aligning with procurement. It's very important to do that. So what are our key challenges? We have some challenges here with this. Typically, this is an idea that breaks it down when we look at distributed architect, high degree integrated between IT and OT. We got to be on top of that. Kyle talked about the diversity of supply chain and technology. Those issues are going to continue. We have to partner with them. What are our expectations? These are the standards. So rather than us tell them, they need to be forthcoming on their SOC 2 Type 2 reports to making sure they're doing the right thing. They're adopting security first and making sure that they're adopting the necessary standards, whether it be related to data in transit and data at rest, all the way down to also the endpoint that will be sitting on our network if we procure and do business with that. Then difficult integrating safety and cybersecurity world. This has been an issue. I mean, yes, wheels on the train go round and round in a safe way, but defining safety, what is safe, cybersecurity now is also a prelude to that, and that should be part of integrated into the safety factor, because now we're moving into the era from an analog paper-based environment to using these new train systems that have tons of technology on it, and that information now has to be secure as well. And then we have increase in, and that leads to the increased connectivity to the digital train, sharing that information into our networks before, again, separated because of analog systems. And then the long cycle for equipment and certification processes, and my previous presenter, Kyle, he addressed it as well, so I won't beat a dead horse. So when we look at those pillars of cybersecurity, risk plays in the assessment process. We want to be able to take into account the issue of governance. Good governance plays a long role. Governance first across the strategy is very important. So IT infrastructure, operations, people, facilities, all of that play an integrated role. And the key is going to be governance of all of that. So these critical components of your program are going to be very instrumental, taking a 360-degree approach to it, based on a risk-based approach, protecting people, processes, and technology, and as well as the data, because now we're becoming a more data-central, digital-centric environment. And so data protection is going to be important. The TPRM, our third-party vendor, our management program is going to play a key role as we adopt the Internet of Things, IoT, things such as communications platforms, such as things like Zoom, Teams, GoToMeeting, all of that plays a major role. Endpoint detection and response, network detection and response, application database mobility is now, we're out there in the field, our engineers, our people, our peer collection machines also play a role. And then the other thing is identity access management, and that whole stack of how we, single sign-on, two-factor authentication. But a big thing is going to be also the security awareness and training of our people. We need to make them aware, to kind of ward off things like, for vendor email compromise attacks, business email compromise attacks. These are the things that will lead to compromised credentials. And these are some of the things that we face just now. Our people are doing more. COVID-19 has accelerated the digital transformation issue. And so now people are working remote. They need to be aware of what they do, what they're using, what they're receiving, what they're reading, and making sure they're not clicking on the wrong links to compromise their accounts. And a big thing is going to be a uniform integrated incident response plan. It's important that you work also in public-private partnerships, with your vendors, but also with the government agencies like CISPRID, and making sure that you're sharing information and that you're receiving information that leads into an intel-driven threat profile that you'll be able to respond adequately and share information across your enterprise. And then as I wind down, one of the things I want to put out, and this guy Lee Allen said something, he repeatedly had said it in a couple of his presentations, and I like it so much, I keep it with me. It says, put cyber security risk management on the agenda before it becomes the agenda. It's important for us to do that because now we have to be proactive before it was been slow. But I'm seeing, at least over the last 5 to 6 months, as I talk to people through the consortium and various information systems platforms that I've been involved with as a CISO, that it is becoming the de facto cyber risk management and managing that and getting and educating the businesses all the way east, west, and north and south of all the organizations. And I believe strongly that this will provide us with, like similar to other critical infrastructures such as oil and gas and utilities, and also pharma, health, all of these have gone through financial services, the pains that we have from a legacy type of systems to now, convergence and modern technologies and adopting, external, cloud-based technologies to continue our business. And so, for the sake of time and 1 o'clock, and hopefully I can bring that home, I hope I have been able to keep us on track, and it's been a pleasure. And I look forward to interacting with you for questions.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Michael. I think you did bring it home well. My experience in that CISO role is where you ended, which is it needs to be a front of mind issue for the very senior management and the board in order to enable the CISOs to do the types of things that everybody here on the call has talked about. So we did get deep in all the presentations, so we're going to have a pretty limited amount of time. And I think we still want to show the final poll, which starts to get the audience involved. We've got one more poll, if we bring that up right now as we move to the Q&A, which is, again, we think we've got 4 great perspectives on this question from the speakers, but if we just take a moment and have the audience answer this, this question in front of us, which is relatively straightforward in terms of how prepared do you think the rail sector is for a cyber attack? 1, significantly more work. 2, a reasonable amount of work's been done, but more is needed. 3, the sector is well equipped to deal with a possible attack. So we will take a moment and have everybody answer, and we'll use that as a segue into the Q&A period. And Anja, as we move towards Q&A, I know we've got at least a couple questions in the question area, and now we have the answers. I think this was probably estimable, but over half the people said significantly more work was needed, and I think some probably believe work is underway, but that more is needed. Very few people think that the rail sector is well equipped to deal with a possible attack, and I will tell you from my prior perch in the financial services sector, even though very significant investment was being made even by global institutions, we still felt like there was more needed. And I think the challenge in front of us is how to invest properly and get that risk management Correct. So again, we've only got about 10 minutes. There's a lot of directions we could go with the questions. I think, we'll bring it back a little bit. And I wanted to ask both Jesus and Michael and Kyle, sort of a fundamental question that was touched upon, but is one of the things we were trying to deal with in this webinar in general, which is, the segmenting networks questions. It's come up, but like segmenting networks and control risks from, OT versus IT is fundamental. And do we have, what are the main challenges there, and are the right tools and processes available? Jesus, I think we'll start with you, because I know you all focus on that, and maybe the notion of what is distinguishable between a firewall versus a unidirectional. You hit on that in your presentation, but we should probably, talk a little bit about that here. And then Kyle and Michael, as you confront that challenges, what are the one or two things that you focus on, in order to make that boundary tight in order to manage risk?
Yeah, so the most important thing, and I have been working with customers on that, is there is not an understanding of what is the information flow that goes from OT to IT. I have been working with rolling stock, with signaling systems, and in the control center. And the first question I ask is that, what information do you require from IT to be sent to OT? And what information are you sending from OT to IT? Do you have this info? Do you know what are your control flows and your information flows? And the question is no, because the mentality is an IT mentality of opening ports in a firewall. I open port 22 and 25 and 26, and nobody knows what these ports are or what they mean. They just open ports and so applications can start exchanging information. But they lost control of what kind of information flow exists between these operational systems, systems that they are hacked, they will disrupt operations, and the IT. So when we come in, the first question, because we don't work as a firewall, we have to understand the information flow. We have to understand the information that needs to be shared from OT to IT, because we're replicating this information one way. So it's very beneficial, and you have seen this in the CISA and NSA's report. The first thing they say is that you need to understand very precisely what information is being exchanged between OT and IT in order to secure it. So our product really provides you this initial step. You really need to understand your control flows rather than use a firewall and open ports. And that is the first step to be cyber secure, is to understand these information flows.
Kyle, Michael, perspectives. Kyle, you first.
Yeah, I think what Jesus is hitting on is what we still face in the industry, which is the traditional firewall right now. We're largely stuck with the same technology. There's new things like what Waterfall's presenting, right? But we're largely still playing with the same technology, and a firewall oftentimes doesn't understand what OT is saying. It doesn't understand the language, and that is problematic because it's hard to enforce security rules when one piece of hardware is designed to talk and understand IT specifically, because it just lets things through, right? If it doesn't understand what's happening in that environment, it's hard to defend. It's hard for it to take defensive posture. So that's certainly one of the things we're facing. We're trying to hold on to the old air gap model as long as we can, as much of the environment as possible. It's a losing battle, as I was talking about. But that ramping up, I think the biggest challenge we got right now is ramping up and the amount of time it takes to manually configure the devices to be able to understand what's happening in OT right now. It's a lot. It's a lot of work, and I think we're continuing to look for other solutions that would help.
Michael, any perspective on this
particular
issue?
Yes. Hi. The thing that you're right, Kyle, about the air gap and how long the air gap session will hold on. Convergence is forcing it. I think that it'll be driven by the amount of attacks that we see and the attempts, but the market itself will drive it in terms of technologies coming in the future. So we're definitely seeing that in terms of firewall and what gets through and talking. I look at encryption. I'm looking on the sensitivity of the data going through and the data flows. That I'm paying attention to that. What level of encryption is needed data in transit, data at rest.
Michael, I think we may have lost your voice.
You hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. So that data is that in the middle.
Yeah, Michael, you're fading in and out a bit. So I'm going to suggest, just in the just a sort of very limited time, I've got another question that came up in the actual control panel, so I'll turn to that one. It's from Edie. We could mispronounce the name, but these. And she basically has a question for the representatives, the operators, which is to the effect of understanding the call for default by cybersecurity in the industry. Understood that should be baked in. When do you, as people in charge of the security for these organizations, really see that standards require it? And what are those standards? And she suggests TS, I think 50701 and IEC 62. I think 62443. But I think the overall notion is, like in safety in rail and in most transportation industries, are sort of first order. We will do this first before you either let the train out of the station or the plane off the ground. When do we get to that point? In this industry, Tom, you may have a perspective as well, but I'd let Kyle and Michael go first. Michael, we'll see if we can get through your voice problems, and then Tom maybe coming over the top of them.
All right, how about now? Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, great. So it's funny you mentioned IEC 62433. So, and that's the risk assessment process. I mean, it's important that people take a look at that and really manage their risk accordingly, identifying that risk, and adopt those risk standards, such as NIST 882, mapping those controls appropriately. I think that we'll see more and more emergence of standards for North America. We're still, I think, behind that of Europe. And so as we look at the International Electronic Commission and what they've been doing, and those standards and how robust they've become in everything they do in Europe, we're going to follow as NIST gets their hands and convert some of those standards to meet the needs of America. So I'm beginning to see that, and when I'm having conversations of proposed standards, they're looking at our industry as to how they can get their hands around it, and they're still trying to do that. CISA is certainly doing some research on that area so they can effectively control. Sort of communicate out to the world as to what those standards should be across our industry. So.
Yeah, Michael, I'll take it over to Kyle. Kyle, I know you're working on some industry standards. And again, I'll mention that in financial services, we ended up trying to take the standards work and come up with one for our industry, just sort of in lieu of the government imposing one on us. I don't know if you have a view on that. Tom, you may have a view as well. So Kyle, over to you.
Yeah, it's real, and I know there's limited time, so I would say real quickly, if I understand the question right, if I try to interpret it, tease it apart for a second, I think what we're looking at the CIS top 20 right now is where I would point people to if you're trying to think about what hikes. I think the question was really what kind of things should we be focusing on the industry side, on the if we're manufacturing. Something we're looking at is the CIS top 20. Those are your basic hygiene kind of standards. There's a few other things that wouldn't be applicable, but if you start talking about those, you start looking at those, I think it brings you a lot closer to what we're expecting and what we're going to expect to see before we allow anything to come onto the network, I think, in the near future.
Thanks, Kyle. Tom, I'm going to, basically give you sort of cleanup as we reach the bottom of the hour and the timing for the seminar, to be respectful of everybody's time. And as somebody that, interacts for the industry as a whole, where do you see the evolution of sort of regulation and standards being things that really have to be in place, and then I'll wrap it up.
Well, Greg, the question really ties in well with the poll that introduced this segment and the consensus of the participants that more needs to be done for rail cybersecurity. And I can tell you that the members of the Rail Information Security Committee for our industry would align with that viewpoint, because their constant commitment is looking for ways to improve. On the issue of standards, they very much applied a standards-based approach from the inception of the committee. About the first 15 years is internationally recognized standards, and of late, railroads and the committee have shifted to the National Institute of Standards Technology Cybersecurity Framework. And so we've benchmarked our industry cybersecurity posture against those standards and the references that come with both the international group that we had previously followed and this framework now. And I think that collective effort is reflected in other aspects. Supply chains come up a lot in this discussion. In our industry, going back to 2016, 2017, the committee developed a risk-based procurement policy, guidelines for railroads who are making information technology procurements, the sorts of questions they ought to be asking vendors specifically to get to the issue of cybersecurity, and a lot of those nagging problems that persist when new products and capabilities are brought to bear.
Thank you, Tom.
Just one closing thought. Ultimately, the issue is, are we taking the right preparations? Are we creating the foundation to continuously improve? And I think, yes, a poll can say that more needs to be done. The practitioners will agree that more needs to be done. Well, let's recognize the productive work that has taken place. And more importantly, let's recognize what we learned from the discussion this afternoon, the sorts of avenues that are being pursued in freight rail, in passenger rail, in supporting sectors to address these very significant concerns. The uniform commitment is to continuous improvement. And a strong foundation has been set. My colleagues on the panel today have certainly brought to bear their own experiences in setting that foundation. So thanks very much for the opportunity to close out.
Thanks, Tom. The panel has presented just really deep views on what's necessary, what's the threats, how operational organization and the industry as a whole are addressing it. I think I would have fallen in that last poll right there in the second. It's clear that we have leaders in this sector trying to both do the right thing and making practical progress. We've got an industry that supports them with the right sorts of capabilities. Jesus, I'll make a call out, particularly to Waterfall, and thank you for sponsoring this session today. I certainly learned a lot as an individual, not in the sector, but very interested in the industry. And I wanted to thank both the panelists themselves, but also the audience. Got only a little bit of audience interaction, but I very much hope this was useful to you. I think all the speakers in the IRITS will be available for follow-up if there's additional questions. So thank you very much. And Jules and the team at IRITS, I would call that a wrap if you all agree.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Greg, for the excellent handling of the panel and session. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to all of the audience attending the session. You'll receive information on how to access the recording of this webinar, etc. shortly, and the information about future webinars will be available on our website soon. So thank you everyone, and have a good afternoon, have a good evening wherever you are. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.